All right, so we're very delighted to have Elizabeth Weiss join us today. So Elizabeth is a Henry Academy Fellow in New York City for this year, but she's normally professor at San Jose State University for a while longer, I suppose, and not much longer. And Elizabeth's going to be talking to us today about the many tribes of academia, so it's going to be a very interesting talk. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for asking me to come to this event and talk. I'm just going to start off with reading a list of some of the many tribes of anthropology and academia who have actually written letters against my book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, or against my talk at the Society for American Archaeology, or lately against my last canceled talk that was for the American Anthropological Association. So I will start.
Should we just get up, turn off the AC/DC?
Yeah.
Or is there normally AC/DC in the background music to it? Yeah. Any HxA event.
Okay.
I couldn't get the that's a triple color though.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
So you think she got it?
I think she's going to ask you to turn it down. So.
Sorry about that.
Wow.
We're going to see a bunch of academics do hair good now.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't notice the background music at all while we were just sort of chatting there, and then all of a sudden, like, whoa! Just kind of noticed that.
It's back in Weiss.
Oh, it was that way now.
That's white now? Yes.
Nice.
It's that easy.
Is that good?
Very good.
There you go.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Okay, so I'm going to start off with reading a list of some of the groups who attacked me for any one of my cancellations, whether it was the open letter against repatriation and erasing the past, my talk at the Society for American Archaeology, last year, my talk that was canceled at the American Anthropological Association. So I had a letter of dissent, so to speak, from the Queer Archaeology Interest Group, the Black Trowel Collective, the Trans Doe Task Force, Women in Archaeology Interest Group, Association of Black Anthropologists, Association for Queer Anthropology, Association of Indigenous Anthropology, and there were many more. But you can tell, one of the things that this showed me was that there's all these kind of tribes. And we're kind of interested in tribes in anthropology, and usually we're focused on the Native American tribes. But there are all these other tribes who have come in more recently. Sometimes it's just a tool, such as cite Black authors. Other times it's an association, like the Association of the Latinx anthropologists. But I wasn't aware of this before Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which came out in 2020, came out. I was just kind of focused on two things. One, my research on bones, which took most of my attention, right? And two, preventing bones from being reburied. And so I thought that my research on bones and preventing bones being reburied was actually quite a narrow topic. And I was surprised when Repatriation and Erasing the Past came out in 2020 that I was attacked by all sorts of tribes that had seemingly nothing to do with Native Americans. So a little bit about my book. So Repatriation and Erasing the Past was written in, it was written for the anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And I wrote it in conjunction, or co-authored with James Springer, who is a retired attorney. And we were concerned that the law, NAGPRA, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is actually a violation of the church and state because it allows repatriation of bones based on creation myths, oral tradition, which are almost always creation myths, requires traditional Indian religious leaders to be part of the committee. And so we decided to work together after having read each other's work for many years, to work together to write this book. And when it came out, we both were, you know, it was a very academic book, so we both kind of thought, oh, it might sell a few copies and, you know, that's that. But instead, it became kind of a lightning rod for all these other tribes. And what happened was there was an open letter calling for the book to be depublished, censored, whatever term you wish to use. And this is when I became more aware that there were these other tribes and that it was all very much interconnected. I think there were two things that really kind of made those who are not just interested in Native American research aware of the book. One is that we do point out that repatriation ideology, and we talk about repatriation ideology as an ideology that is for the reburial and repatriation of skeletal remains and artifacts. It is not just an act, not just a law, but also an ideology. And that ideology is a postmodern ideology where we have the victims, in this case Native Americans, their story being the important story and that facts don't really matter. And so that is why they get away with making statements like, we've always been here, we didn't come across no land bridge. And so I think that the fact that we start our book off with that statement that we're going to talk about ideology and not just the act and link it to postmodernism is one of the reasons why the other tribes started to attack us. We also argued for a return to objective knowledge. Anthropologists are not high on objectivity in the sense that they don't really believe it exists. I'm not sure they really believe that truth exists or facts exist anymore. So that's what was one of the things. But I was also surprised that we were accused of being racists, and accused that the book was accused of being racist. And some people pointed out to the fact that we used the term race. And we actually have a little footnote in our book saying the reason why we're using it, we understand that race is a complex term, and but the reason why we use the term race is because legally it's used in multiple connected cases with reburial and repatriation laws, so we were following that. So, but what ended up happening is once one of the tribes attacked us, basically you get a piling on. And the open letter that called for the book to be published had something like 900 signatures calling for the book to be depublished. And then a few months later, Jim and I were presenting at the Society for American Archaeology on a very straightforward talk on creationism and repatriation requests. And we basically said that if there's going to be a repatriation request, and I'm against all repatriation, I think that bones shouldn't be reburied, but if we're going to make that compromise, that should be at least done on facts, not on myths. And so this was attacked by many of the tribes of anthropology too. And it just, as things were going along in 2020 and in 2021, I started to see that more and more identity politics played into not just repatriation ideology, but academia in general in a way that I had not been as aware before. And so some other things that happened that, that drove this home was at my university, in my department, one of my colleagues put out an email to our listserv saying that we should he encourages us all to use the Cite Black Authors database. And so I had responded fairly gently, I thought, that although this is well-intentioned, that I think we should cite the work of the best researchers available and not focus on the person's race. And that this then caused my department to shut down the openness of the listserv and start policing everything that went in. Not the Cite Black Authors comment, but my response to it. And so they basically shut it down as an open listserv. And I thought, that's another example of this kind of tribal politics, political identity. It also explains in some ways why anthropology has become anti-Western, anti-science, in that they're supporting the tribes, and in some ways the Native American tribes, but in other ways the other tribes as well, as opposed to kind of a focus on the individual and a focus on the data. And so although there's the queer archaeology interest group or the women in anthropology, they're fine with what I would call sexist regulations such as menstrual taboos and only men can handle these bones, and databases that are separated by access by men and women, literally like computer databases where the Native Americans material that can only be accessed by men and materials that can only be accessed by women. There was quite a lot of concern whether that this should even be in the same spreadsheet or the same file type of material. And I figured the reason why feminists are okay with this kind of sexism is because they're supporting another tribe. If it was a single individual who was engaging in the sexism for the sake of being sexist, they wouldn't support it. And so, they end up supporting weird things like the Queers for Palestine, because they're supporting another tribe. And one of the first things that my department did when they decided to rewrite the protocols to access of skeletal remains is put in a menstrual taboo that if you're a menstruating personnel, they didn't even use the word woman, but if you're menstruating, you're not allowed in the curation facility. So we all know that this comes from these kind of concepts of uncleanliness, but the feminists then redefine it as, it's because when you're menstruating, you are so powerful that you cannot be with those individuals who have been dead for thousands of years. I think that this also boils down back to the postmodernism with the concept of oppressor and oppressed, and therefore victimizer and victim. And so they're defining, basically, all the tribes are defining victimhood as anything that deviates from the natural order of things. In some cases, like the Queer Archaeology Interest Group or the Transdo Task Force. and then they join with other tribes. Now, Transdo Task Force is kind of an interesting group because they're actually forensic anthropologists who want to focus on the question?
Yeah, I don't understand that expression, trans something.
Doe. So Jane Doe,
Oh,
so John Doe, Jane Doe,
okay, trans
right?
Doe.
So Trans Doe. Task Force. The forensic anthropologists who are arguing that you shouldn't identify sex, you should identify gender. So if that person died, you should identify what their gender was, as opposed to what their sex is. Now, if you take a skeleton, if you're a forensic anthropologist, and you take a skeleton, you can only identify whether they were male or female. You cannot tell what they identified as.
Just look at their pronouns.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and they've actually done research trying to figure out if they can do if they can identify whether somebody underwent feminization surgery, so like surgery that literally changes the bone, and they can't. It's still, and this is all the males going towards females, and those the data still line up that it looks like a male even after surgery. So now maybe at some point they'll get better at that, and I'm not against that, but I'm against abandoning the identification of sex for identity politics. So, and it really also overlaps with this kind of non-Western perspective, because they define these deviations, so to speak, as non-Western. So if you're looking at the sex and gender issue, you'll read that many people argue that the binary concept of sex is a thing that white colonialists invented. And the American Association of Biological Anthropologists has said that not only it's their fault, the biological anthropologists who started off as white Western males have invented the sex binary, and now we have to move away from that. We know this is not true, but and ironically, if you think about like the two-spirit concept, the Native American two-spirit concept, that is a recent invention. It was coined only as recently as 1990. So this is a recent invention, but it's not played as back. I do think that the best way to fight against all these tribes is to basically, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and to show the absurdity of these things. We've all now seen the memes of fatties for Palestine, queers for Palestine, right? But people don't know about the other tribes, which many of them are just as absurd. And I think that there needs to be, people need to be able to see what's going on in academia, and anthropology is one of the leaders in these, so that we can see where things have gone seriously wrong. You can use the system to fight against these kind of tribal attacks. The first thing, of course, I sued my university, but even without that, I used the system when they put in a menstrual taboo. I said, I will file a Title IX suit, and they removed the menstrual taboo. They just did not want to deal with it. I was already in the lawsuit, so they knew my intentions were sincere, that I wasn't backing down. But there's definitely ways to use the system. We need people to speak up publicly. I get emails, and even more so in the past when my book came out and when a lot of the cancellations were coming out, that I agree with you, I completely agree with you, or I nearly completely agree with you, or I support your standing up, or I'm, you're so courageous, but don't reveal my name. don't say it was me. One of the first emails that I got was from a state archaeologist who, basically was very supportive. And I was like, oh, this was right when my publishers were, thinking about withdrawing their support from repatriation and erasing the past. And it's still available. They never depublished it, but they wrote this groveling letter about how decisions in the past led them to, publishing is a slow process, and how decisions in the past led to mistakes now, and we're sorry that we published a racist book. But I think people need not only to speak up, but to let their names be attached to that, especially when their names are important. A state archaeologist, for example, or another professor. And so when I approached my publisher, I said, this is what I got, a letter, it held pretty much no value because I couldn't reveal my source, right? So that's not to say I didn't have many very strong supporters who would reveal the names and show their names, but the initial ones were would not. I think we have to be able to laugh at these things. I think that's an important aspect, because when we get upset about it, I think that people just kind of relegate us to, the angry white person, or the angry anthropologist in my case. But is academia, can we save academia? I don't know. I don't know. I'm leaving San Jose. I'm retiring. My retirement is about 20 days away or so. I'm very much happy with my decision. It was, I had always thought that I would retire as soon as I didn't have access to skeletal remains. And because of the law that then in California passed several laws since 2020 to make access even more difficult, basically I realized that I would never get access to the remains in San Jose again, and that if I really wanted to continue my research, I needed to be free from San Jose to be able to go where collections are. And collections are becoming more and more inaccessible, even non-Native American collections. One example, for instance, is the Smithsonian had a online exhibit. It had a real exhibit and then a virtual exhibit tied together, which was the Jamestown exhibit that was not Native American. And they took it down, and they basically have now a 4-page apology in its place on the website, basically saying that they decided to take it down because of the sensitivity of showing skeletal remains, even though the ancestors of these people were for the exhibit, were for the website, but it doesn't matter because those people don't count, and it's the tribes that count. So in a sense, people say to me many times throughout this time, well, why don't you just study your own relatives? And well, if I was in Europe, I probably would be studying Europeans. And I have studied Europeans before. It's not that I'm opposed to that. But the fact is that that it's not going to end with Native Americans, because as one of my colleagues said, if you show a photo of a skull, regardless of the skull, regardless of the ethnicity of the skull, it might still upset a Native American, because that will bring back some intergenerational trauma. So it's not going to stop at that ethnic divide. But the other reason why I settled my case is because, and I think that my case was very specific because of the Native American connection. Native Americans in the U.S. are considered, the tribes are considered sovereign. You cannot sue them, but in order to proceed, I needed to include them, but I wasn't allowed to include them, so it's a catch-22. And somebody needs to figure out how to get out of this catch-22. Berkeley professor Timothy White tried the same thing with the Paleo-Indian remains, fell into the same catch-22. You cannot sue them, but you need to include them. And so I knew that going forward, I would maybe get some relief on the other aspects, but not enough to stay. So although I'm hesitant to say that all of academia is not savable, I am more prone to say that I'm not sure that anthropology can be saved, at least physical anthropology. So when I decided to apply to Heterodox Academy for the year, for the faculty fellowship that started last August or September, one of the things is I thought, oh, you know what? I'll go look at museums. They have bones. It cannot be worse than universities. I was completely wrong. I like to point out that when I'm wrong, I do admit it, and I was completely wrong. The Mutta Museum has now removed all its images of remains from its website, even though if you go to the museum, they do have remains still there. I don't know how long that's gonna stay, but the first thing you see if you go into the Mutta Museum,
What's that museum?
the Mutta Museum, it's the museum. It's a surgery and anatomy museum that shows anatomical anomalies and variations. They have a huge wall of skulls, and it's probably the most famous of the anatomical museums. And the first thing you go in to look at before you get into the room of bones and so forth is you see a big BLM sign. I guess they figured they can't take away the bones, they have to do something, right? Has nothing to do with their museum. Private collections are being targeted, and there's a effort to basically argue that collections that are held in private museums might now not be considered private anymore if they took any COVID monies. So that's another aspect. And of course, we have recently seen with the Biden administration's mandate for indigenous knowledge and the recent changes, which are really tweaks to the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, that we have widespread closure of all exhibits that involve Native American collections. And most museums, main museums, have also taken away skeletal collections, display of skeletal remains, even if they're not Native American. So we'll see what happens, but I am not sure, although I'm not sure that anthropology can be saved, I'm hoping that the rest of academia can. That's it.
Can I ask questions?
Well, yeah, you mentioned there's a group of queers for anthropology. Should I look around and be aware that there might be an organic chemistry LGBT interest group as well?
I would not be surprised if there is. Yeah, I would not be surprised if it. I think what's interesting about anthropology is that we really started off as a field of, in order to understand humans, you have to look at the other, and understanding the other is supposed to help humanity in general and understanding evolution. And we've become I look within and then I put my stamp on the past. And that's why you get these kind of like queer archaeology interest groups. Like they're just you'll see like articles like the queer lens in anthropology, whether it's looking at Romans or Vikings. I'm sure that it will get to the Australopithecines if you give them enough time.
Yeah, so they're sort of queering the subject.
Yeah, queering the subject.
And it's going to be tough with molecules.
Not possible. Yeah.
They'll find a way.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, it's interesting you say that anthropology is in trouble in academia. I'm wondering if you can clarify this here, because part of your job, of course, is intergenerational transfer of your expertise. Do you think that expertise in examining ancient skeletons is actually in trouble of dying out?
Yes. So I think the difference is, academia has a lot of fields where, most of the material is written, or, and of course, I'm not saying that this is every field, of course not, but like, for example, English literature, history, a lot of these fields have written materials, and that's what you need to study. And therefore, even if we have a whole generation that just goes completely mad, at least we can go back to the materials that were there before. But anthropology, physical anthropology, is different. You need the remains. And so once the remains are buried, you don't have the remains anymore, and they're not going to be dug up. So you're losing the data set. And the other thing is anthropology, physical anthropology, is very hands-on, as some of the sciences, right? And so forensic anthropologists are oftentimes trained using teaching collections that have a little bit of historic archaeology remains there that ended up in the collections, some from the anatomy, medical school from the India, where they had a big skeletal market for many years, and so we have these kind of hodgepodge collections. And now what's happened is that in California, for example, they have 2 laws that prohibit the study of using teaching collections if they have any Native American remains. And one of the problems is, they prohibit the using Native American remains in the teaching collection. But one of the problems is that oftentimes you don't know what is what, because one of the most important things to learn in anthropology, if you're doing skeletal remains, is to learn fragments, right? So you want to, you have a collection with tons of fragments, and so you will have drawers of fragmented bones, and now because if any one of those can be shown to be Native American, then the whole thing may be taken away, because it's like, well, if it's possibly Native American, then this is problematic. And so what you'll lose is you'll lose the next generation that's trained in forensics, or you'll lose the next generation that's trained in paleontology, so that if they go out to the field and looking for fossils, they don't know how to spot a fragment of a bone as opposed to a whole bone. We're not. I can teach all of you within a day, or maybe a week, the whole skeleton if you have whole bones. But that's not what we do, because when do we get that kind of preservation? And so I think we are losing in anthropology. We are literally losing the data, and therefore we can't train the next generation, and it's a constant training, and therefore we will lose the field.
Okay, so you're saying that you thought the reason why physical anthropology seems to be destined to decay is that you're burying the data sets, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that other aspects of the academy have written documents, so the data will remain there. But do you think, is there any other evidence or reason to believe that the academy can be saved even if the data is there? I mean,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
yeah.
I'm not sure. I do think that there is some backlash. I actually think that there's a good reason to, to point out the most absurd. So if you think about, when I was teaching, I oftentimes, like if I was going to teach the controversy of whether we should rebury or not the bones, repatriation or not. And I would use the strongest argument from my side, of course, but I would also try to find the best article on pro-repatriation so that students could really see, that it's not always absurd. But I actually think that in some ways we need to point out the absurd because that's where the backlash comes. And that, I think, is how you might end up saving academia. When students get in and they're not learning anything because it's so absurd, then maybe there'll be enough backlash. Or professors like, there's no way I can teach this. So that even if it's a small resistance group, I think that the absurdity is important to point out, even if you steelman your argument.
What's the background of training in anthropology, and particularly trying to understand how the tribe got so strong? Is there a lot of critical theory in the background of the people going into anthropology, and that's why it's so devastated?
I think almost all anthropologists in the U.S. come from the four-field system. So cultural, archaeology, linguistics, physical, some just from the three, archaeology, cultural, and physical. And so I think that almost all anthropologists have been bathed in the Kuhnian aura and postmodernism from intro to cultural anthropology starting off. And so there's kind of, even the physical anthropologists are oftentimes very open to these kind of arguments that are not, that there's no objective truth, that there's no, that everybody is biased, and the victim narrative. But the other thing is, you would think that anthropology, like the biological physical anthropologist would be the most sensible, or that archaeologists would be more sensible than cultural anthropologists, and it's just not true. I mean, I think in one way, one of the things that surprised me too is that the archaeologists might have had been the most absurd, and I think this is in part because of cultural resource management type of jobs where they have to work with tribes at sites like building sites and so forth, and in order to, you gotta get along, right? So some of that. The other thing is, I think that people think, oh well, you know what? If I just get along, if I just collaborate, I'll always have my collection. And so I do think that that's part of it. I think they're wrong. NAGPRA was built on a compromise. The compromise was very basic.
What was it,
NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a big one, right? So Canada doesn't have it doesn't have quite a federal law, but it has lots of repatriation, and I'll talk about that in 2 nights, I believe, right? The compromise was that the collections that could be identified that linked with a modern tribe would be repatriated. And that there was a category of unaffiliated. So either there is no group that really can be connected, or we don't know. And there was also, the other thing is that NAGPRA wasn't supposed to touch teaching collections. It was about research collections. And then not all artifacts. So sacred objects, funerary objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And now the definition of sacred and the definition of cultural patrimony has been broadened so wide that it means nothing. So for example, one of the things that I encountered in my lawsuit is that basically the tribe decided that the x-rays I was requesting were sacred. Now, sacred in NAGPRA was literally defined as something you needed to practice their traditional Indian religion. Well, they did not have x-rays, so it couldn't have been required. But in order to fight that, I would have needed to have the Native Americans in the lawsuit, would need to add them, and I wasn't allowed to because of Catch-22. So it's kind of spread in that way. So I do think that is the other issue, is that this kind of spreading of NAGPRA, the compromise falling apart.
Yeah, no, very fascinating, absolutely talk about it. I'm kind of interested in looking at this ideology of progressivism and how it sort of became more and more extreme, but I just want to take it back earlier and to wonder, at what point, for example, could you say that an indigenous creation myth was a social construct and was constructed in this way? Was it, if we went back to the sort of 60s, how much was sensitivity distorting the knowledge, the truth project?
Right.
If we go back to those earlier phases when this belief system was just kind of getting started, and then the sort of political correctness wave of the sort of late 80s, early 90s, how much distortion was already there? I mean, I remember taking anthropology classes in the early 90s, already quite a bit of romanticization going on.
Yeah, and we had, there's a whole noble savage.
Right.
I mean, Hollywood has been very romanticizing of it too, and literature, even years ago and before movies were even made, right? But I think the American Indian movement was very key in being aggressive and pushing forth this kind of, we have a traditional Indian religion. And that's happened really in the 70s. In the 1960s, there was still quite a few Native Americans who worked with anthropologists to excavate and weren't concerned about reburial. And sometimes we're like, oh, I didn't know that there were remains here. Or, oh, you know what, I think that there were remains there, but they didn't treat it as necessarily sacred. And I think it's kind of interesting that the Native American political correctness movement has decided to latch on to this, we always buried our remains. This is so Native American, it's every tribe almost. And we know that's just not to be the case. And so I have a sense that it's actually partly that they've incorporated a lot of Catholicism in there, and that their traditional religions are not traditional at all, and that it's just kind of a Catholicism mashed up with some new agey stuff, and and I think that happened in the 70s. That's my sense, at least.
Welcome to Canada. You got bullied essentially and driven out of your job because you didn't do what they told you. We're not having a discussion about these residential school graves. It's not discussed.
Yeah. I have written an article about that with Francis Widdowson. One of my favorite people in the world. So it's kind of interesting because when I was doing my postdoc, so I used to live in Canada, and from about 2000 to 2003 or 99 to 2003 or so. And I did my postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. I don't think it's called that anymore. That's in Ottawa. And when I was I did my postdoc there, and I collected my PhD data there. And when I was collecting my data, my PhD data, the HxA were going through the halls of the curation facility, taking skeletal remains for repatriation and reburial. And the curator at the time was like, "Don't let them see you're looking at bones," to me. And so, you know, it's interesting that these issues were already a problem in 98, 99, even without a federal law in Canada. And once they finished their going through and their rituals and taking back the bones, and everything was said and done, about 2 or 3 days later, the curator, you know, got very upset. He took a phone call and got very upset, and he was like, you know, "I can't believe this is happening." And I was like, "What? What's happening?" He's like, "They want the casts, and they want to destroy the casts. They want to, you know, the casts of the bones that were the molds." And whenever I told this story for years, people didn't believe me. They're like, "Well, why don't you just make casts of them, or now 3D, you know, scan them, print them off in 3D, and then give the bones back? Isn't that fair enough?" And the reason is, and one thing is, of course, that's not that easy. But even if it was, you know, they would want the casts. They would want the models, because it's not about their bones. It's about their ideology, and about they've latched on to this postmodernism and their victim identity, and that gives them power and money often. And so it's not. It is not about necessarily the remains. And I waver back and forth about how much of it is sincere religious beliefs. I tend to think that if somebody tells me something is their religious beliefs or their belief, I accept them at their word. But I do sometimes waver. And we see this with the Indian residential schools. So not a single not a single child's skeleton has been found. Not a single one. They did GPR, ground penetrating radar. They see these little blips, like, oh, there's a body there. And it's likely not a body, we know that now. But where the excavations have occurred, like there have been a couple excavations, I believe, in like North Dakota, didn't find any children's remains. And when I was the last time they allowed me at a conference, which was not last year, but the year before, it was the American Anthropological Association conference. I went to a talk about the Indian residential schools and ground penetrating radar. And the speaker said that excavation is not necessary to prove this, because we have the victims' narratives, we have but also that doubt is violence, silence is violence, of course, too. So if you disagree, or if you are skeptical, that's violent. If you don't say anything of supportive, that's also violent. And that the ground penetrating radar tools were actually, they were sacred tools that were guided by past spirits to help them find those spots. So we shouldn't doubt it that way. So you have like all these three absurd things in like the matter of 30 seconds of this person's talk. And nobody was like, "What the hell are you talking about?" You know, they just nodded along. So, yeah.
I think you touched on this before, but you were talking about two-spirit
Yes.
beliefs and how they sort of arose in the 1990s. If you look at, for example, Christianity or Islam and any of the practices involved, you often can go back centuries or, in some cases, millennia, where you find written documentation about, that this is what was done back in 500 or whatever. And if somebody told you that this happened, you could actually go and check in a way, go to a library, etc. But I wonder, like, is there any real, like, strong evidence of any indigenous belief in the country that maybe this goes outside of anthropology?
Well, in a sense, yeah, that's very difficult, right? Because they didn't leave a written language. Native Americans, First Nation people, Australian Aborigines, the Maori in New Zealand, all didn't have written language. So we don't know what beforehand what their beliefs in that sense was. I think that, we do know that certain cultures have kind of, certain, like trends or so that accepted as gender variations, like the castrati, or, in India, the males who dress up like females. But one of the interesting things about these is that they're almost always looked down upon. A lot of times they're involved. Castrati is probably the exception, like the singing, Italian. But almost always in all the other cultures, it's actually looked down upon, and oftentimes deals with sex work or untouchables if it's a caste system. And it was the progressive West who said, these people shouldn't be treated this badly. So whether they had these kinds of categories in Native American groups before contact, we don't know, because they didn't leave a written record. And if you're looking at just artifacts, that, in a sense, the sex variable, male, female, is the independent variable, and the artifacts are dependent. So if you find a male with a sewing needle, maybe that just means that sewing wasn't a female occupation. Or if you find a female with like hunting tools, maybe she hunted, but maybe also, somewhat a male who was, grieving for put something in that, put mortars and pestles, are found in both sexes in many groups. It's not necessarily the case that the funerary good is linked to gender expression, and so the assumption should actually be that that if there is if there isn't clear-cut male artifacts, female artifacts, that this culture didn't identify sex and gender in those manners, maybe in other ways, right? So, I could be, if I die, people might say, oh, we want to put in a toy truck in her coffin. Doesn't necessarily mean that I was non-binary, right? So I think that's one of the things, is like, we will not get to determine gender with artifacts. And since they left no written record, we cannot say whether they had those. But what we do know is that if you look at the period of contact, we do not have evidence that these kind of non-binary or two-spirit or, the individuals were noted by any of the Europeans who wrote about them. And they wrote about all sorts of things, good and bad. It's not true that like the European who contacted the Native Americans only were all bad. A lot of times they actually put very favorable things about them, but they also wrote unfavorable things. So when in Peru, when anthropologists first were coming across the writings of certain missionaries that had written about child sacrifices, modern anthropologists in the 60s and 70s didn't believe them, didn't believe the writing that, oh, this is propaganda, anti-indigenous propaganda to convince the church that more missionaries are needed. And it was archaeologists and anthropologists in the 80s and 90s who then found children who were sacrificed. So not everything that was bad that was written was necessarily true, but it was not necessarily false either. And the same thing with the good things too. But we don't have a written record that this was a concept that was in many tribes or even in any tribe. Eric?
Yeah. I mean, I was just wondering. There are some tribes in the southwest of the U.S. where you have, like, the old cave, the cave dwellings, and my understanding was that the tribes that are living in those areas have no connection to those earlier. And I'm just wondering if if we can document changes in these myths where groups now suddenly say, oh no, we are descended from those people. Can you show, or do we have any evidence that there has been sort of some tweaking of these myths over time?
It's kind of interesting because we do have evidence, like the scientific evidence that shows a lack of connection, but then the oral myths that show a connection, many of these arise late, even late 80s. So part of it is NAGPRA and repatriation movement helped to make this important. But the other thing is how NAGPRA was originally written was that any connections should be made on a preponderance of evidence, so genetic artifacts, historic documents, so forth, oral history. And now they've added 2 categories and changed the balance. One of the categories is traditional knowledge, and then the other, and another category is similar, and they've shifted the balance to the Native American oral history, myth, and traditional knowledge. It's no longer preponderance of evidence, and the Native American repatriationists engaged in this, they're considered expert witnesses, and it cannot be questioned. But so some of this is very recent, right? But I think that this kind of, insistence that we have always been here, this is, I think, starts in the late 70s, 80s, when NAGPRA was kind of not passed yet, but there was rumblings that this would arise.
Elizabeth, when you said you give your students strong arguments for and against repatriation, what's the strongest? How do you articulate that to them? I imagine there's lots written, but how do you talk to them?
I actually look for the best written counterpoint, right? So I think the strongest argument is if there is a link, a true link, that we kind of accept that people who are related make decisions based on the burials. But I think that one of the strongest arguments that I have read, and I can't even remember when this was published, but it was published quite recently, quite quickly after NAGPRA was passed, was that there was a case where a historic site was excavated and then they reburied the Europeans but not the Native Americans. This is an example where would be like, well, I actually would be against the reburial on both sides, but if you're good, and both parts were historic. So I would say that that's a strong argument, and that this was one of the early parts of the movement. So it actually, excavation and the burial of the Europeans happened before NAGPRA was passed. and it was used to argue for NAGPRA. So that would be, for example, a good argument for the repatriation and reburial of remains that are clearly linked.
Thank you.
Oh.
I guess I was wondering, so why not cast a wide net here? I guess in this particular case, or broadly, like what are we losing, I guess, by eliminating or by having repatriation, and what kinds of knowledge, what are the costs, I guess?
Okay, well, I think the costs are, one of the costs is the training of forensics anthropologists. I don't think that you can really train a forensic anthropologist without a skeletal teaching collection. So I think that that's one of the costs. But I think the other cost is that we lose our ability to reconstruct the past most accurately. And when we start to lose that ability, we start to focus only on, our modern differences as opposed to common humanity. One of the things that I did throughout my career is I had kind of three types of studies I would do. One is I would try to reconstruct the past. What were these people's lives really like? A second part of that would be looking at whether something is biological or cultural. And if you see trends that are cross cultures, cross time, then you can say, well, that must be something biological as opposed to cultural, and that helps us understand humans more generally. And then the third thing is looking at individuals. And so understanding, reconstructing the past, forensics, understanding differences between biology and culture and remains, but also there have been practical purposes like in medicine, and one of the things I do, for example, is sometimes publish in medical journals, helping us understand variation that is normal versus pathological. For example, many people have back pains, and what we've noticed is that people go to the doctor for their back pains, and they'll get surgeries and so forth, and it won't do any good, right? It's not useful. And part of this is because what they're repairing is actually normal variation, such as an extra vertebrae is quite common, or a fracture between the body of the vertebrae and the arch of the vertebrae is quite common. So this actually has helped to inform doctors what, if you see a fracture, you think, oh my goodness, we got to repair that. But some fractures don't need repairing, and that something else is causing the pain, so you repair that fracture and it doesn't resolve the issue. So anthropologists were, for example, key in pointing out that sometimes the sternum has a naturally occurring hole in it. This helped forensics, not only forensic anthropologists, but also those doing autopsies, realize that that's not necessarily a bullet wound. It's a naturally occurring hole, but also prevented some injury with like acupuncture. I don't think acupuncture works. Not surprisingly. But if you're going to do acupuncture, you better know whether there's a hole in your sternum, because if there is and they go through that hole, then you could die, right?
Yeah.
So these kind of things cross over to medical research. And anthropologists have been one of the main body of employees teaching anatomy. So you lose anthropology, you lose people who teach anatomy who are teaching the next doctors. So it really does, it has practical implications as well as just really intellectually curious and and first,
So this was just awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all this. I was actually going to ask a question similar to Michael's, but I'll ask a different one. So you talked about the people who were privately sending you support. And I was just reflecting on the Coddling of the American Mind documentary. And one line that stood out to me when I watched that first was somebody who was in a similar sort of cancellation situation. And he said all of the messages of support were reply to, all of the messages of, outrage were reply all, right? So you end up with this perfect scenario for just perpetuation of pluralistic ignorance or that kind of falsification of what people believe. And so I was wondering about that, and also whether you have a sense of like what are the actual proportions of people who buy into this, right, in your field, and just to connect it to some of Eric's work. I think you were looking at like the demographic change and these sorts of things, right? So the number of people who are more junior academics who really buy these things, whereas people in other, like more senior groups are kind of keeping their head down, but might be going with, what's going on. So do you have a sense of that?
Unfortunately, I think that the cohort that is now like starting out professors to assistant professors on the tenure track are full of believers.
Yeah.
And I say that because so one of the things I've been doing recently is I've been looking at whether there is actually any access to collections in all the California public universities. So far, I have not gotten a single email saying, here's a protocol for access to any collections. And I've contacted all the CSUs and all of the UCs, so the California State Universities and the University of California. I haven't heard back from all of them yet, so I'm not saying that there is no access, but so far, and one of the things I noticed is that when going through the websites, because it's not always clear who to contact, one of the things I noticed with going through the website is like almost everybody's list of interests is, decolonization, queering, the trans, it's so, nobody's just like, you know what, I just want to look at disease, I'm just interested in, artifact manufacturing. How did they make that obsidian point? It just seems like that is not even, these are not even topics that are accepted anymore almost. And so like if you would read, like going, if I was now to put together my own thing, I'd be like, I'm interested in reconstructing the past and in paleopathology and diseases of the past. And I don't think that there are many who are just interested in the past for the past's sake. So I do think that the people who are supportive are less and less. And one of the things my husband and I always joke about is how old all my supporters are. So, I have one who's like 74. We call him the young guy.
Well, the last event we had here, one of the best critiques from the audience was, "You're old. You'll die soon. We don't have to listen to you."
They're all going to retire, and then the new crowd's going to come in. I can see how this can. I was on an anthropology search committee one time. I had to go for, was it one of those bias training things? Because I was a dean's representative, and it was just comic just to go to that. What I don't, I can see how it could happen in that subject. I just don't see how the science is just not going to work.
No.
Right. So I mean, unless there's going to be a huge excitement about trans-esterification, right? Because that trans-esterification is an area of reactions with esters, and it's got the word trans in it, so perhaps people are going to fall grip. You see what I mean? You could really work at this, or NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, MRI machines.
Yeah.
That's an assignment, right? An assignment on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Is it an assignment at birth? I mean, what kind of assignment? Peaks are assigned. So, there's all sorts of areas where we could talk about this in science, but it's just going to get ridiculous to the point the subject won't operate. Like you said, yours is just, well, you
Yeah.
don't have the bones, you can't.
You lose the
Yeah.
basic
And I
knowledge.
actually
But-
think that if it becomes ridiculous, that's when we might see a turnaround.
Right, so that's what we.
Haven't seen a turnaround anywhere of any kind.
Yeah, right, because
Yeah,
you're not convinced it's gonna go, it's still gonna go up, right?
Yeah, I'm
Is
not
it
sure.
possible?
I'm not sure that we hit peak yet.
The third
We
wave,
have-
right, is
We
coming.
have seen some backlash against, not in academia, but against the trans movement in general, especially with
Right.
children. We have seen that, but I'm not sure that it's hit academia yet.
All right, any other questions?
I had one more thing
Okay.
actually, yeah, because I'm part of the LGBT community, I apologise. Because that's a group of people that I'm embarrassed to say have, you know, like the most ridiculous, absurd, liberal, but illiberal ideas actually collectively, and really not as intelligent as I hoped they would be as a group, even though I'm a member of it. Right. What I didn't understand was why the 2S bit has migrated magically to the front. I mean, for those of you who don't know,
Yeah.
LGBT, it's 2S LGBT.
Yeah.
We have to foreground. I've never met a two-spirited person. I have asked throughout the community. I live in the gay community in Toronto, which is where all the gay men pretty much in all of Canada are. Trust me, I know, because we have apps and we know there's hundreds of us. Right? So, I mean, if anyone's got a chance of meeting a two-spirited person, it would be me, and I have not met one. Is this just made up?
It's kind of interesting because this goes to that intersectionality. So it's like, I think that there are victims who have like multiple victim status, and so the 2S has, you know, the indigenous status, and then the non-binary status, and then they get first billing, right?
Right.
And I think that's
pure
how to see
virtue
it.
signaling.
Yeah.
Because all of the literature that came out, all the emails, suddenly it moved it over.
Yeah.
You changed the password, right? On the
Yes.
right.
The acronym is getting so long that
It
there are
is a
interests
password, isn't
that
it?
the
Yeah.
conflict.
It's a really
Actually, maybe that would be a good password, right?
It is a good password.
I know.
It's got star and plus and things as well. So you can actually use
You have
it.
a number, yeah.
Yeah, right. It's got a number in it. It doesn't have any lowercase yet, but they'll think it's something.
And it changes weekly,
Yeah,
so
that's
it's perfectly
right.
It'll keep the
secure.
IT guy happy.
At the University of Regina, they're quite common actually.
Mhm.
Find
They're
2S
common here,
people.
Right. So they do exist. Okay, so I've got to
At
get
least
out there.
within indigenous
Right.
university communities.
Yeah, because
But
I was
not
told.
with just common gay men.
No,
These are
no.
different
Or
groups of.
common indigenous people. that-
No, because I was
that-
told by someone, he said, lots of indigenous people think this is ridiculous too.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that you do have, indigenous people, Native Americans, who are just as like aghast at some of this than academics, and I'll get emails from Native Americans who are supportive, but they're not academics, you know, and so.
It's the elite capture thing.
Yeah.
So.
And one of the big things that's going to be very problematic very soon is that the new NAGPRA rules, the new Native American Grants Protection and Repatriation rules, require museums to basically consult constantly. And so this is problematic to determine what can be shown and what can't, what is sacred and what is not. And why this is problematic is because, let's say you've decided to show these artifacts and you get a tribe coming in, they say, yeah, no problem, that's fine. And then next year, new chief comes in and they say, no, those are sacred. Well, you can't use yesterday's permission to, so it's constantly changing. But the other big thing is that this does not exclude newly created artworks. So, replicas are going to be repatriated. Some of them already happened. And one of the things that when NAGPRA was passed was Native American artists were very concerned that this would impact their ability to sell their art. And now with these new changes, it might do so. So, which is, you know, another whole can of worms.
So how do we disabuse the academic elites of this, what Edison calls the, you know, the luxury beliefs? Because they're addicted to it.
Yeah.
It's like heroin, I would say. I mean,
Well, it's a broader religion, isn't it? The religion of anti-racism, sexism, etc.
In many cases, so I'm thinking people that I know who are indigenous in LaurierHxA and at least a couple or two-spirit, I believe. And in some ways, I'm not going to speak about specific people, but in some ways, I think that a lot of that set of identities is because people who manage to make it into academia are often not coming from the genuine disadvantage, right? So they're coming from a relatively privileged group of people for whatever reason who also have one of those identities. And so you can't actually talk about things like structural inequalities and things that maybe still are unfair and should be addressed in society. Instead, you have to make up this whole set of symbolic things that are injustices, because those are the only things that they can really lay claim to. Or at least that's part of what I think is happening there.
So I wanna.
Most of them sort of. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Are most of them off reserve and let's say quite intermixed?
Yeah, they
Yes.
wouldn't have lived on a reserve in there.
And would they be sort of small percentage native background, or would they be, you know, would they pass as
That
native?
varies.
Oh, it varies.
Yeah, that varies. And certainly that's an issue.
Right, right.
I mean, but I might be 1/16 Welsh coal miner.
Right.
So I want to be correct. You know, I mean, where's the correction? And by the way, you know, coal miners had a shorter life expectancy in the 19th century than the slaves in North America. You know, black slaves in North America. So
So I want to shamelessly plug my book.
yes.
It's coming out on the 15th of this month, May 15th. On the warpath, my battles with Indians, pretendians, and woke warriors, and I have a flyer over there. And it talks about a lot of these issues, and it also addresses some of those things about like how much Native Americans they are, and the funny numbers that universities use to beef up, you know, Native American counts and so forth. So feel free to take a flyer and pass the word on. And
I should say Native Americans are, they lean towards Trump quite significantly in the opinion poll, which is interesting.
not inactive.
All right, well, we're going to stop the filming here, so just to wrap it up, please join me in thanking Elizabeth again.